Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Let's see what happens when Mark makes his decision. Mark walked back to his small apartment that night, drenched from the rain. His mind raced, torn between his pride and the desperation of his situation. He had been juggling debt for years, and the weight of his father's financial legacy was starting to crush him. His mother, sick with cancer, had drained their savings. His younger sister's tuition loomed over him like a dark cloud, and Mark couldn't afford to lose any more time. The offer Eleanor Brooks had made sounded like a lifeline. He had no idea how he could ever repay the debts on his own, but could he really marry a woman he didn't love just to save himself? He lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the rain tapping against the window like a soft reminder of his mounting problems. The next morning, Mark met his mother for breakfast at a local diner. Her pale face, still recovering from the chemotherapy, looked frail under the fluorescent lights. As they sat together, she reached across the table and touched his hand. "Mark, I know you're trying your best," she said softly. "But you need to think about your future. I see how hard this is on you. If this woman, Eleanor, is offering you a way out, maybe you should take it." Mark looked at her, the guilt building in his chest. He had promised to take care of her and his sister. Was this the right choice, or was he selling out? After breakfast, Mark went back to the bistro to meet Eleanor. He found her seated at the same corner table, waiting for him. There was no sign of impatience in her demeanor. She was a woman used to making things happen. As he sat down, she looked up at him, her sharp blue eyes steady, unbothered by his hesitation. "Have you thought about my offer?" she asked, her voice calm, almost businesslike. Mark nodded slowly, still uncertain. "I've thought about it, but I'm not sure if I can go through with it. Marrying someone for convenience, it doesn't feel right." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her gaze unyielding. "You're not the first person to feel conflicted. This isn't about love. It's about survival. And I've seen enough of what happens when people let their pride stand in the way of practical decisions." Mark hesitated. "But I don't know you. How can I marry someone I've just met?" "You don't have to know me. That's the point of this arrangement," Eleanor said with a small smile. "You'll have your debts cleared, your life secured, and in return, you'll be my husband in name only. We won't interfere with each other's personal lives. You can continue your studies, your career, whatever you choose." The idea of being free from the burden of his father's debts, of having some semblance of stability, was tempting. But still, Mark's heart was not fully convinced. Eleanor was offering him everything he wanted, but what was he giving in return? "I'll think about it," he said, but Eleanor shook her head. "Mark, this isn't a decision you can take lightly. I'm offering you a way out, but I need a commitment from you now, not later." He paused, feeling the weight of her words. He had always been a man of integrity, but integrity didn't pay the bills or ease the weight of responsibility. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. Survival. What if this was the only way he could truly help his family and secure a future for them? As he sat there, still uncertain, Eleanor stood up and placed a business card in front of him. "Think about it," she said. "But don't take too long. If you decide to accept, come find me. I'll be waiting." She walked away, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. He looked down at the business card. It felt like a lifeline, but at the same time, it felt like a chain. He could feel the pressure mounting. He had to make a decision, but what was the right choice? Later that evening, Mark found himself walking through the city streets, the lights of the skyscrapers towering above him. He tried to clear his mind, but the weight of his decisions pressed on him. Could he really marry a woman he barely knew, all for the sake of money and security? Or was this the moment when he had to swallow his pride and accept that sometimes, survival came with a price? The next day, he returned to the bistro. He was ready to make a choice. As he walked into the restaurant, Eleanor was already waiting, just as she had been before. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "I'm ready," Mark said, his voice steady but filled with a hint of uncertainty. Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good," she said, her voice calm. "Let's make this official." As they signed the papers, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this decision, while necessary, would change the course of his life forever. He didn't know how long the arrangement would last or where it would lead, but he knew one thing had just made a choice that would alter everything. Now, he had to learn to live with it. Let's see how Mark's life changes as he begins this new chapter. Mark sat in his apartment, the papers in front of him still fresh with the ink of his signature. His mind was a whirlwind. The decision he had made felt surreal, like he had stepped into a world that wasn't his own. The contract he had signed was more than just a legal document, it was the beginning of a new life, one that felt both like a relief and a trap. Eleanor had made it clear from the start this wasn't about love, it was a business deal. But as the days passed, Mark found himself questioning what that truly meant. Was he truly okay with being a part of this arrangement? He wasn't sure. But he had no other choice. The next morning, Mark woke early, the weight of the decision still heavy on his chest. He grabbed his phone and saw a text from Eleanor, "We need to meet today. Let's discuss the next steps." His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard from her since the day they signed the agreement. This was the moment when the reality of their new arrangement would settle in. He gathered his things and left for the cafe where they had met before. As he entered, he saw her sitting at the same table, her posture straight, her demeanor calm. She looked up as he approached, her sharp blue eyes giving nothing away. "Mark," she said, her voice cool and professional, "I'm glad you've come. Now that you've signed, we can move forward. There are a few details we need to work out." Mark sat down across from her, still unsure about how he felt. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice steady but with a hint of nervousness. Eleanor gave a small smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Now we begin our arrangement. I'll pay off your debts, and you will fulfill your role as my husband. There's a charity event in 2 weeks, and I expect you to attend with me. It will be a public event, and we need to show that we are a united front." She paused, watching him carefully. "You'll need to learn how to navigate these kinds of events, how to act, how to present yourself. This is more than just a title, Mark. This is a performance." The weight of her words sank in. This wasn't just about paying off his debts or gaining financial security. This was about becoming part of her world, a world that he knew nothing about. Mark had always been someone who valued authenticity, and now he was being asked to pretend, to step into a role he didn't understand. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "I'm not good at pretending. I've never been good at that kind of thing." Eleanor's expression softened, just a fraction, but it was enough for Mark to notice. "Mark, you're not pretending. You're stepping into a role that will help both of us. This is an opportunity. And for you, it's a chance to start over. Don't you want that?" He nodded slowly, feeling the pull of her words. He did want it. He wanted to start over. He wanted the weight of his debts to vanish. He wanted to take care of his family. But he wasn't sure he could do this, even if it meant securing his future. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll do it. I'll learn how to be a part of this world." Eleanor's lips curled into a small, approving smile. "Good," she replied. "We'll start with the gala. You'll accompany me as my husband, and we'll make sure everyone knows who you are. It's all about appearances, Mark. And for now, you're the one I need." She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Get ready. It's time to step into this world." Mark watched her leave, her presence still lingering in the air. As he walked back to his apartment, Mark's mind was racing. He felt like he was losing himself in this arrangement, but he also knew that he had no choice. This was his chance at a new life, at a fresh start. But at what cost? Days passed, and Mark threw himself into learning the ropes of this new world. Eleanor had arranged for him to meet with her advisors, to practice the etiquette of high society, to learn how to speak and behave in these circles. It felt like he was becoming someone else, someone he didn't recognize. The more he learned, the more he realized how little he knew about the life Eleanor led. It was a world of wealth, influence, and power, a world where appearances were everything. The night of the gala arrived, and Mark stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tuxedo. He looked at himself, trying to see the man he had once been. He didn't recognize the person staring back at him. The man in the mirror was someone who had learned to fake it, to wear a mask and pretend. But as he buttoned his cuffs and fixed his tie, thought crossed his mind: this could be the beginning of a new chapter, the end of the man he used to be. Mark arrived at the gala with Eleanor, his arm around her as they made their way through the crowd. He was the picture of composure, but inside, he felt like a stranger in a foreign land. He watched as Eleanor interacted with the elite, effortlessly moving through the crowd like she belonged. And for the first time, Mark realized that maybe, just maybe, he belonged too. Let's see how Mark handles the pressure of this new life and whether he can keep up with Eleanor's world. The gala was everything Mark had imagined and more. The room was filled with elegantly dressed men and women, their laughter and conversations echoing off the high ceilings. The atmosphere was thick with luxury, the kind of luxury Mark had never experienced before. He stood by Eleanor's side, his hand resting lightly on her waist as they mingled through the crowd. For the first time in days, Mark felt a strange sense of power, the kind of power that came from belonging to a world that felt so distant from his own. But as he glanced around, he realized just how out of place he truly was. His tuxedo, though impeccable, felt like a costume. He wasn't one of them. He was an outsider trying desperately to fit in. Eleanor, however, moved with ease through the sea of faces, exchanging pleasantries with the city's elite. She was in her element, her poise unwavering as she made introductions and chatted with business partners. Mark followed her lead, doing his best to play the part. He smiled, nodded, and shook hands, all while feeling like a spectator to a world he couldn't truly understand. As the evening wore on, Mark found himself standing alone by the grand window overlooking the city. The lights from the streets below flickered like stars, and for a moment, he felt a strange sense of isolation. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this wasn't it. The glamour, the wealth, the endless stream of introductions, it all felt hollow. He had thought that this would be the answer to his problems, the solution to everything he had struggled with. But now that he was here, he realized it wasn't that simple. Was this the life he wanted? Was this who he had become? His thoughts were interrupted by a voice. "You look lost in thought." Eleanor appeared beside him, her presence calming yet commanding. Mark looked at her, meeting her gaze for a moment before looking back out at the city below. "Just trying to take it all in," he said quietly. "It's a lot to process." Eleanor nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I know it's overwhelming, but you're doing fine. This is part of the deal, Mark. You're here because you agreed to this life. It's not easy, but you have to play the part." Mark turned to her, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. "I get that. But sometimes, I don't feel like I belong here. All of this isn't me." He gestured to the crowd, the lavish decor, the endless conversations about money and power. Eleanor studied him for a moment before replying, her voice thoughtful. "You don't have to be like them. You just have to play the role. You can still be yourself. But for now, this is what we need. This is what will give you the future you've been fighting for." Mark didn't know how to respond to that. He had agreed to this life, to this arrangement, but the weight of it all was starting to settle in. What had he given up in exchange for financial security? His freedom? His sense of self? He couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake. As the evening progressed, Mark found himself drawn into another conversation, this time with a businessman who had been eyeing him since they arrived. The man was well-dressed, his words smooth and polished. He was interested in Mark's background, in his plans for the future, and it quickly became clear that he was testing Mark's ability to navigate this world. "Tell me, Mark," the businessman said, leaning in slightly. "What do you want to do with your life now that you're part of this circle? You've got your debts cleared, your future secured. What's next?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. He wasn't just making small talk. Mark hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I'm still figuring that out," he said, his mind racing. "Right now, I'm just focused on doing what I have to do." He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this felt different. This was no longer just a simple contract. This was a world of expectations, of pressure, and Mark realized he was being judged not just for who he was, but for who he was becoming. The businessman seemed to sense his discomfort but didn't let up. "You're in a unique position, Mark. People like us, we don't just exist. We take control. We create opportunities. You have the chance to do something big, something that could change everything." Mark nodded, his mind buzzing. He knew what the man was saying. He had been given a chance, a rare opportunity to change his life. But at what cost? He had agreed to this, but now he was starting to feel the weight of it all. Was this the life he wanted? Or was he simply a pawn in Eleanor's world, a world where he had no control? As the night drew to a close, Mark stood beside Eleanor, both of them overlooking the city from the balcony. He could feel the weight of her presence beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You did well tonight," she said, her voice low but sincere. "You're starting to fit in." Mark didn't respond, his thoughts swirling with everything he had learned that evening. Was he really fitting in? Or was he simply pretending to be someone he wasn't? He didn't know the answer. But as the night ended and they left the gala, Mark realized one thing: his life had changed forever. Whether that change was for the better, he wasn't sure. But he was in it now. And there was no turning back. Let's see what happens next as Mark continues his journey in Eleanor's world. The following week, Mark found himself in yet another world he barely recognized. Eleanor had arranged for him to attend a business luncheon, an event filled with powerful people who seemed to have everything figured out. Mark stood by her side, his palms sweating in his perfectly tailored suit. He had spent the past few days rehearsing his responses to potential questions, trying to learn the ins and outs of high society. Yet, despite all his preparation, he still felt like an outsider. Eleanor, on the other hand, moved through the crowd with ease, her charisma and confidence leaving everyone she met in awe. It was like she was born for this world. Mark couldn't help but feel small next to her. As they entered the venue, a grand hall with massive chandeliers and marble floors, Mark was struck by the opulence. The rich, golden tones of the room contrasted sharply with the simplicity of his past. He had never imagined that a place like this could exist outside of movies. He followed Eleanor closely, trying to keep up with the conversation, but he couldn't help but feel lost. They were surrounded by CEOs, business tycoons, and politicians, all of them engaged in deep discussions about mergers, investments, and strategies. Mark's role in this world still felt uncertain. They made their way to a table near the front, and Eleanor introduced Mark to a few of her colleagues. He did his best to smile and nod, repeating the little bits of small talk he had practiced. But inside, he felt like he was faking it. No matter how much he tried to blend in, he could never shake the feeling that he didn't belong. Eleanor was talking to a man across the table, and Mark found himself alone for a moment. As he looked around the room, his mind drifted back to his old life, the life he had left behind. The debts, the stress, the constant worry about tomorrow. Here, in this room full of the rich and powerful, he was free of that. Or so he thought. A waiter approached, offering Mark a glass of wine. He took it, his hand slightly trembling. He wasn't used to this kind of attention, this kind of luxury. He sipped the wine slowly, savoring the smooth taste, but it didn't make him feel any more at ease. The whole thing felt like a game, and Mark wasn't sure if he knew how to play. As the conversation continued around him, Eleanor's voice cut through the noise. "Mark," she said, her voice calm, "I need you to understand something. This isn't just about being here. It's about the long term. We're building something bigger. People here will respect you if you learn how to leverage this position. This partnership, this arrangement, it's not just about us. It's about creating opportunities." She looked at him, her expression serious. Mark nodded, trying to absorb her words. He understood what she meant, but the reality of it all was starting to sink in. This wasn't just a contract to pay off his debts anymore. This was a life he would have to live, a role he would have to play. And every day, it felt like he was losing more of himself to this new world. He had signed up for security, for stability, but now that he was in it, he couldn't help but feel a growing emptiness inside. As the luncheon came to an end, Eleanor made her rounds, chatting with potential clients and business partners, while Mark was left to stand quietly by her side. He had become the perfect accessory to her life, a silent partner in a carefully curated image. The way the room looked at him, some with curiosity, others with indifference, reminded him of how far he had fallen from his old life. He wasn't sure if he had traded one cage for another, but as the evening drew to a close, Mark knew one thing: he had no way out. Later that night, Eleanor and Mark sat in the back of a luxury car as it drove through the streets of the city. The city lights outside blurred into streaks, and the weight of everything that had happened in the past week began to settle on Mark's shoulders. He looked at Eleanor, who sat across from him, her gaze focused on the road ahead. "How did I do today?" Mark asked, his voice tentative. Eleanor didn't immediately respond, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the question. "You did fine," she said finally. "But you need to get more comfortable. You're still trying too hard to fit in. Relax. This is your life now, Mark. You need to make it your own." She paused, then added, "I know this is difficult, but you've made your choice. And now, you have to live with it." Mark leaned back in his seat, staring out the window as the car sped through the city streets. The lights, the sounds, everything felt so distant now. Was this truly the life he wanted? Or had he made a deal with the devil? The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, social events, and business dinners. Mark continued to play his part, always by Eleanor's side, always in the background. The more he learned about her world, the more he realized how little he knew. It was a constant game of appearances, where one wrong move could cost you everything. And every day, Mark felt more like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. As the week wore on, Mark began to feel the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. He had everything he thought he wanted: money, security, status, but at what cost? Eleanor had warned him that there would be sacrifices, but he hadn't expected to feel so empty. Let's see what happens next as Mark continues to navigate his new life, and whether he can ever find peace in this world of wealth and power. The days after the gala passed in a blur of meetings, dinners, and events. Mark continued to follow Eleanor around, learning the ins and outs of her world, but it never felt like he truly belonged. He was always a step behind, trying to catch up. Every interaction, every conversation, felt like a performance. It was as if he was playing a role, pretending to be someone he wasn't. And each day, it got harder to remember who he used to be. At home, Mark found himself staring at the ceiling late into the night, unable to sleep. He had been living in Eleanor's world for weeks now, but it felt like a dream, a world where everything was pristine and polished, but nothing felt real. He had grown accustomed to the luxuries, the grand events, the fine dining, but the emptiness inside him had only grown. His debts were paid off, his future was secure, but at what cost? He had traded everything he once cared about for the life he was now living, and he wasn't sure if it was worth it. One evening, after another business dinner, Mark found himself alone in the back of a private car with Eleanor, the city lights flashing by outside. Eleanor had been unusually quiet during the event, her usual poise replaced by a distant air. Mark couldn't help but notice the change in her demeanor. Something was different. "You're quiet tonight," Mark remarked, his voice breaking the silence. Eleanor glanced at him, her eyes sharp. "I'm always quiet," she said, her tone cool but not unkind. "But tonight, I'm just thinking." "About what?" Mark asked, his curiosity piqued. Eleanor sighed, looking out the window for a moment before speaking again. "About everything. About how quickly everything changes. About how sometimes, you think you're in control, but you're not." Her voice softened, almost imperceptibly. "I thought I could control everything, this deal, our lives, your role in all of this. But now, I'm not so sure." Mark was taken aback. He had always seen Eleanor as the person who had everything figured out. She was strong, confident, unshakable. Hearing her speak like this was unsettling. It made him question everything he thought he knew about her and about himself. "You're the one who put this all in motion," Mark said, his voice careful. "You're the one who offered me a way out, a way to change everything." He paused, trying to understand her sudden shift. "Isn't this what you wanted too? To have control over everything?" Eleanor's expression darkened, and she turned her gaze back to him. "I did. But sometimes I wonder if control is worth it. I'm not just talking about you, Mark. I'm talking about everything. My business, my life, the image I've built for myself. It's all slipping away, and I'm not sure how to hold on to it anymore." Mark felt a pang of sympathy for her, but it quickly mixed with frustration. He had thought that by entering her world, he would find the answers to his problems. But now, it felt like he was just as lost as she was. He had gotten everything he wanted, the financial security, the status, but it hadn't come with the happiness or fulfillment he had imagined. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. "You've got me. We made this deal together. And I'm still here, doing my part." Eleanor gave him a small, almost wistful smile. "I know," she said softly. "But sometimes, I wonder if you understand the weight of what we've both agreed to." She turned her eyes toward the window again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been living in this world for so long, Mark, but it feels like I've lost something important along the way. And I'm not sure if I can get it back." Mark didn't know how to respond to that. He had spent the last few weeks trying to fit into her world, trying to be the perfect husband, the perfect partner. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were both trapped in a game neither of them had fully understood. The car pulled up to the front of the penthouse, and Eleanor stepped out first, straightening her jacket as she walked toward the building. Mark followed her, feeling the weight of her words still pressing on his mind. He wanted to help her, but how could he when he wasn't even sure how to help himself? That night, as Mark lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind about control, about loss, about not being able to hold on to everything. He realized that, just like her, he had been living a life of appearances. He had traded his freedom for security, his identity for a role. And now, neither of them seemed to know who they truly were. The next morning, Mark made a decision. He couldn't keep living this way, pretending to be someone he wasn't, pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. He had to make a change. But what change? What would he do next? He didn't know, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had to take control of his own future. He couldn't just be a pawn in Eleanor's world. It was time for him to figure out who he really was, and what he truly wanted. Let's see what happens next as Mark begins to question everything about the life he's built, and whether he can find a way to take control of his own destiny. The next few days felt like a turning point for Mark. He had been living in a world of pretense, playing a role that wasn't his own. But after that conversation with Eleanor, something inside him shifted. He couldn't ignore the emptiness he felt anymore. Every time he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. He had lost himself in this world of luxury and appearances. But now, more than ever, he knew that he needed to take control of his life. He couldn't stay in this bubble forever. He needed to find his own way, to reclaim his sense of purpose. Mark spent the next few days thinking about his options. He wasn't sure where to start, but he knew he couldn't keep living in Eleanor's shadow. He had to find his own path, one that didn't involve constantly playing a part in her world. Eleanor had given him everything: financial security, stability, but at the cost of his freedom and identity. It was time to make a decision. One morning, as he sat in his office, looking at the papers that had once seemed like his escape, he realized that he didn't want to be a passive participant anymore. He needed to break free from the arrangement with Eleanor, even if it meant risking everything he had gained. He couldn't keep pretending. It wasn't healthy, and it wasn't sustainable. He thought about his family: his mother, who had always believed in him, and his younger sister, who still needed him. Mark had promised to take care of them, but he had lost sight of that promise in the whirlwind of his new life. He had become so focused on the security that came with Eleanor's world that he had forgotten why he had started this journey in the first place. It was time to talk to Eleanor. He knew this conversation wouldn't be easy, but it was something he couldn't avoid any longer. He needed to be honest with her and with himself. That evening, when Eleanor returned from a meeting, Mark was waiting for her in the living room. She walked in, looking as composed as ever, but Mark could see the exhaustion in her eyes. It was clear that she, too, had been struggling with the weight of everything. "Eleanor," Mark began, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "We need to talk. I've been thinking a lot about everything: the deal, this life, and where we go from here." Eleanor stopped in her tracks, her gaze immediately locking onto his. She could tell this wasn't a casual conversation. She knew Mark was serious. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge of concern. Mark took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "I appreciate everything you've done for me. You've given me a chance to start over, to secure my future, but I feel like I'm losing myself in all of this. I don't know who I am anymore. I can't keep living like this, Eleanor. I need to find my own way." Eleanor's expression softened slightly, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes: surprise, maybe even hurt. She had always been the one in control, and she had expected Mark to be grateful for the life she had offered him. "Mark, I get it," she said quietly. "This isn't easy. But you've changed my life, too. You've given me something I didn't even know I needed. But if you need to walk away, I won't stop you." Mark looked at her, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. He knew this was the right decision, but it didn't make it any easier. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "But I need to do this for myself." He paused for a moment, then added, "Thank you for everything." Eleanor nodded, her face unreadable. "I understand," she said simply. "Sometimes, the best thing we can do for ourselves is to walk away." Mark stood up, taking one last look at the woman who had changed his life in so many ways. "Goodbye, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I hope you find what you're looking for." As Mark left the penthouse that night, he felt a weight lift off his shoulder. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't the end of his journey, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally taking control of his life. Let's see how Mark begins this new chapter of his life, and whether he can truly find himself again. Mark spent the next few weeks finding a rhythm in his new life. He had walked away from the world Eleanor had built for him, but he wasn't sure where he was headed next. The freedom he had gained felt both exhilarating and terrifying. He no longer had the luxury of relying on Eleanor's influence, but he also felt a sense of clarity that had been missing for a long time. Without the constant pressure of pretending to fit in, he could breathe again, but the path forward was unclear. He had no real plan, just a desire to figure out what he truly wanted. One afternoon, Mark sat in a small cafe, sipping his coffee and staring out the window at the bustling street outside. It was a far cry from the grand galas and business dinners he had attended just a few weeks ago. But this simplicity, this calm, was exactly what he needed. He had spent so long chasing something he thought would bring him happiness, but now he realized that happiness wasn't something to chase. It was something he had to create for himself. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Eleanor. Mark, I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear from me, but I need to see you. Please, meet me. He stared at the message for a moment, the weight of it settling in. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to keep moving forward and not look back. But another part of him, one that still cared about the woman who had given him so much, felt a pull. He didn't know what she wanted, but he knew that the closure he needed might only come from facing her one last time. That evening, Mark found himself standing outside the same cafe where they had met months ago. The night air was cool, and the city felt quieter than usual. He could hear the distant hum of traffic, but the noise seemed far away. He took a deep breath and walked inside, spotting Eleanor sitting at a corner table, her back straight as usual, her eyes scanning the room with a calm that contrasted with the turmoil Mark felt inside. "Eleanor," he said softly as he approached. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Mark," she said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, maybe regret, maybe vulnerability. "Thank you for coming." She gestured to the seat across from her, and Mark sat down, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor seemed lost in thought, her fingers gently tapping on the edge of her coffee cup. Mark waited, unsure of what to say or how to feel. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she began, her voice quieter now. "About you, about me, about this life. I never intended for things to get so complicated. I thought I could control it all. But I was wrong." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "I pushed you into this world, Mark. I thought I was helping you, but I wasn't." She paused for a moment, her eyes searching his. "I think I lost myself too." Mark listened quietly, his heart heavy. He had never expected Eleanor to open up like this. She had always been the one with all the answers, the one who had everything figured out. To see her this vulnerable was a stark contrast to the woman he had first met. "I don't know if I'm asking for forgiveness," Eleanor continued, her voice filled with uncertainty, "but I want you to know that I never wanted to trap you in this life. I wanted to give you a way out, but I see now that it wasn't the right way." She leaned forward slightly. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Mark. I hope you find your own path." Mark sat there, taking in her words. Part of him had expected to feel anger or resentment, but instead, he felt something else: relief. Relief that Eleanor, too, had acknowledged the complexity of their situation. Relief that he wasn't the only one who felt trapped. He reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said quietly. "For everything. But I think it's time for both of us to move on." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I hope you find what you need too." Eleanor looked at him, her expression softening. "I will," she said. "I will." Mark stood up, giving her one last look before walking out of the cafe. As he stepped into the cool night air, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The closure he had been searching for had come, and he knew that it was time to step fully into his own future. The world he had left behind, Eleanor's world, was now a chapter in his past. He was ready to write the next one where he was the author, and not just a character in someone else's story. Let's see what Mark does next as he continues his journey towards self-discovery and a future all his own. Several months passed, and Mark found himself settling into a life he had never imagined. After walking away from Eleanor and the world she had offered, he had to start over, completely from scratch. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of his decision felt unbearable, when he questioned whether he had made the right choice. But with each passing day, the answers began to become clearer. He had chosen the harder path, the one that demanded everything of him, but it was the one that gave him freedom, the freedom to discover who he truly was, outside of anyone else's expectations. Mark took a job at a small but growing tech startup, using the skills he had developed over the years to help the company navigate some tough challenges. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but it felt real. He worked long hours, sacrificing time and energy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt proud of what he was building. The money wasn't nearly as much as what he had gotten used to, but it was enough. Enough to get by, enough to feel good about himself, and enough to see that his future was in his hands. One evening, after a long day at the office, Mark sat in his modest apartment, sipping a cup of coffee. He had made peace with the fact that he didn't need millions of dollars or the trappings of wealth to be happy. He had made peace with his own identity, and for the first time in years, he felt content. The phone on the table buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He looked down at the screen and saw that it was a message from Eleanor. "Mark, I know it's been a while. I've been thinking about you. I hope you're doing well. I'm just reaching out to see if you're okay." Mark stared at the message for a moment, his mind filled with conflicting emotions. He had moved on, or so he thought. But there was still a part of him that would always care for Eleanor, even if he knew their paths could never cross again in the same way. He took a deep breath, then typed a reply. "I'm doing well, Eleanor. Thank you for checking in. I've found my way, and I hope you have too." He paused, hesitated for just a moment, then added, "Take care of yourself." He put the phone down, staring at it for a moment longer before walking to the window. The city outside was alive with lights, but the noise felt distant now. Mark had found his own quiet corner in the world, a place where he could breathe, create, and live on his own terms. As he looked out over the city, he smiled softly to himself. He had faced the hardest decisions of his life and had come out on the other side stronger, more certain of who he was. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was in control of his own destiny. Eleanor had been right about one thing: it wasn't about control, but about finding peace within yourself. Mark turned away from the window, ready to face whatever came next. He had learned the most important lesson of all: happiness didn't come from wealth or status, it came from within. And now, he was finally living for himself. As he walked toward his desk, the future seemed brighter than ever. The journey he had started months ago had led him to a place where he was at peace with himself, and that, he realized, was worth more than any fortune. Let's see where Mark's path leads next, as he continues to embrace his new life, fully in control of his own future.